In the early winter months of 1982, the dead body of 8-year-old Vishal Mehrotra was found in the haunting woods of the UK. This was 7 months after Vishal had mysteriously vanished on the day of the royal wedding between Princess Diana and Prince Charles. And then, even though his remains had been found, the case reached a screeching halt that only ended in 2019 when two men noticed an obvious trail of clues nobody had bothered to investigate. This is the story of that one boy, that one day, and that one trail of clues. Welcome to part 2 of the story of Vishal Mehrotra. To push the police to reopen and re-examine Vishal's case, we request you to sign the change.org petition linked in the bio, started by Muntham House, Vishal's sister. Every signature counts. If you or anyone you know has any information relevant to Vishal's case, please reach out on the email ID or Twitter handle mentioned below, both run by Vishal's family. Hi everyone, welcome to the Desi Crime Podcast, a show where we dive deep into some of the craziest cases from around South Asia. I'm your host, Ashwarya.
And I'm Aryan.
And just a reminder, this is the second part to a 2-part episode. If you haven't yet heard part 1, head on over to that and listen to it before you come back to this one. The link for that episode is in the description below. Before we start the case for today, I also want to thank the most significant source for today's episode, BBC Sound's podcast on the case titled Vishal.
I'm guessing the viewers to this episode are just as curious as I am to figure out what happened next or what truly happened. Up until now, we know that there was a pedophile ring in the area where this case comes from
In the 1980s.
Yeah. We also know that there was a alleged group of men that a witness named Nigel had seen while he was driving on a nearby road to where Vishal was found dead eventually.
Correct.
According to him, what he had seen were 4 Asian men and a woman in a sari in a black car.
Correct.
Now, this doesn't make any sense. And I think it's like pieces of puzzle that independently seem to mean something, but together
Don't fit together
they don't
yet.
fit together. I don't know what's happening. Especially because right when we wrapped up that episode, I asked you, was this pedophile ring consisting of Asian men?
And they weren't. The answer
And
is
they
were
weren't.
not.
So now I'm like, okay, there are 2 separate groups of perhaps criminals, right?
Correct.
But I don't know how they're linked, and I don't really know what happened to Vishal. So tell us, what is it in the COVID era that these 3 people were able to piece together?
Let's get into it. Chapter 4, Muntham House, 1981. Muntham House is one of those schools you'd believe some portion of Harry Potter was shot at. Beautiful Gothic architecture on a 23-acre property located in the English countryside, it is exactly as grandiose as what your mind thinks of when someone says the words England and boarding school. But the reality inside the stone walls of Muntham House was a lot less picturesque back in 1981. A school set up inside a former mansion for troubled boys aged 5 to 18, Muntham House was where kids with behavioral issues got sent for a shot at a better life, for a chance to start again. While today it's ranked as an excellent school with an outstanding facility and world-class faculty, back in 1981, for the many young boys who had found their way into Muntham House, there was a monster lurking inside in plain sight in the form of a staff member everyone seemed to love. A man named Nicholas Douglas.
That's the name of the man that wrote the thesis titled Vishal.
Absolutely. Yep.
Who was a loved
A
staff
caricature.
member of a troubled boys' school.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that just doesn't
Bewildering.
bode well,
I
yeah.
know. Described as a big man with glasses and short hair, Douglas was a trusted and important member of the staff at Muntham House. He was something called a house parent, with his job being providing emotional support, guidance, and stability to the boys, much in the same way a father is supposed to. With his home situated on campus premises like a lot of boarding schools, he had constant access to the boys who studied there. And that is how the abuse began. 40 years later, the survivors of Douglas's abuse sat down with Colin as Colin dove deeper into the investigation of Vishal's case. Because you see, Douglas was studying to become a social worker, and as part of his requirements, he had to write a thesis paper. The title of Douglas's thesis paper was one word: Vishal. These survivors, men now in their 40s and 50s, recount how, in their mind, Douglas was closer to a mother figure than a father figure because of how kind he seemed. He would let the boys into his home, let them watch TV there, let them smoke a cigarette when they wanted, and then he would begin grooming them. The verbal grooming, which would begin with asking personal questions, would soon turn physical and eventually turn violently physical. Quote, the worst thing he ever did was just, he took away the little boy, you know. He murdered the little boy in me, said one of the survivors who spoke to Colin. As a decade passed to the abuse and these little boys of 10 turned into men in their early 20s, they spoke up about what they had experienced, which is what led to the beginning of Douglas's downfall. He was investigated for the accusations against him, and in one of those searches of his home, police found the folder containing his thesis titled Vishal, written by him just 2 years after Vishal disappeared. This thesis went into the police's records on Douglas. Douglas and his 2 other accomplices went to prison for 16 years, while a third accomplice ran away to Asia. Normalcy returned to the walls of Muntham House, and everyone forgot about the folder just as they were beginning to forget about Vishal. But it was during these conversations that Colin was having that some key details stuck out to Colin. Firstly, multiple of these survivors revealed they were abused outside of school premises after being abducted from the school to a beautiful home located very close to the metro stop where Vishal was last seen alive, or in a car that the abusers would park in a field, or in other random locations between West London and Sussex. One of the other victims was being abused by Douglas in Douglas's mother's home, which was located very close to Older Cops, where Vishal's body was found. One of the victims was being abused by a different school employee they all used to call Fat John, whose job with the school was driving the kids to and from their homes, meaning this was a pedophile who had access to a school-sanctioned vehicle and often took the same route on which Vishal was taken the day he vanished. This means Fat John abused kids on that route for years by tying up their genitals and taking photographs of them before taking them to and from their homes. This, to Colin, was proof that this group of pedophiles had a connection to the area where Vishal was taken from and the area he was taken to that day, and that the men were capable of abduction too. Secondly, Colin realized that 2 out of the 3 survivors he was now speaking to were of South Asian descent. Quote, the man's obviously got a sexual appetite for an Indian boy, said one of the survivors to Colin, referring to Jim Russell, the accomplice who ran away before he could be caught and is most likely in some Asian country. Not just that, but Colin also realized that when these victims were kids, they all looked remarkably like Vishal. Young, lean Indian boys with similar smiles and facial features. Thirdly, one of the survivors, known to be the absolute favorite of Douglas, tells Colin of a weird encounter he had had with Douglas in the latter half of 1981, after Vishal had disappeared, but his body hadn't been found yet. In this encounter, a deeply troubled Douglas told this boy that he has a friend who's gotten into some very serious trouble and has done something that could send him to prison. This eerie encounter had stood out to the boy, and now it stood out to Colin too. Fourthly, Colin realized why Douglas titled his thesis paper Vishal. You remember I mentioned Douglas was trying to become a social worker while he was working at Muntham House, and for his social work certification, he needed to write a thesis. That thesis was titled Vishal, but it was actually about an abused boy whose name was Kabir. In the paper, he spoke of how he, as a social worker, would deal with the case of Kabir. Turns out, the person abusing Kabir was Douglas himself. Kabir is one of the men giving this information to Colin decades later. But at the time of writing his paper, Douglas couldn't use Kabir's real name for anonymity's sake and had to think of an alternate name. The name he came up with, for some reason, was Vishal. Aran, I just want to dive into this thesis paper information that I've just thrown out at all of you guys right now. What's basically happened is that this man was abusing a kid named Kabir. He's supposed to write a thesis paper on what he as a social worker would do to help a kid. And the kid he's chosen to write this paper on is the kid he is abusing. And he's named that thesis paper Vishal. Yeah. I find that so bewildering. I find that so vile and disgusting. Yeah. I think that detail is just...
I don't know what about this case isn't vile and disgusting, but I can almost, see if I had to be in his shoes, as unfortunate as that may sound, but imagine this guy haphazardly penning down his thesis and going, what name could I think of? And as a white dude, not knowing many Indian names, like, we also, if we have to come up with a sort of a fictional character, white
Right.
fictional character, I will think of names like, okay,
John,
Sam,
yeah.
Nick.
Yeah.
Like, these are all people in my life that I know of.
Funnily, all people we've worked with in the past.
Just worked with though.
Yeah.
But immediately I recall those names. So clearly the same is at work in this guy's mind, where if not the guy that he is abusing, it is one of the kids he's abused in the past, which happens to be Vishal.
That's what Douglas says. But to Colin, it feels like there may be something more to the fact that he's named his thesis paper Vishal. And we'll dive into that question a little bit more. Yeah. And lastly, the detail that stuck out to Colin, from the way these survivors spoke of their abusers, it was clear to Colin that each and every one of them thought that these men were capable of murder. Now, Colin had one and only one question on his mind. Why, in any possible universe, would this pedophile named Nicholas Douglas write this uncommon Indian name, Vishal, as the title of his thesis paper, like Aryan and I just discussed? The answer to that question was a fundamental key in cracking this case. And to get this answer, Colin needed to begin his hunt for Douglas himself, who now had been out from prison for about 15 years.
No.
Yeah.
No.
And to Colin's credit, he tracked him down. From a combination of sifting through news articles of the time and social media profiles now, Colin ended up finding an online profile which had an address that he had also seen in an official case document. And so he decided to show up at that location. And in that location was Nicholas Douglas, the man who once seemed like the personification of evil to young boys, now old and frail, living in a shabby home in the middle of nowhere, UK. Not only did Colin visit Douglas, he also began having and recording conversations with him and slowly building rapport with him, until one day he finally gathered the courage to ask the one question he needed an answer to. Why name the thesis Vishal? And Douglas gave him an answer too. It's the first one that came into my head because it had been in the press, massive publicity. And at the time, I took it as the first Asian name I could think of. It was on the news, it was everywhere, and I was sitting there. I thought, well, I can't call him Muhammad because he's not a Muslim, so what can I call him? And I thought, well, I've seen this name on the news, it was everywhere at the time. And I saw this name. I thought, right, I'll use that name. I did not think twice about it at the time. I thought of this name, I saw it on the publicity, and I thought, right, I'll choose that. End quote. To Colin, this answer is unsatisfactory for a few reasons. Firstly, it irks him that Douglas first says that Vishal was just the first name that came into his mind, and then says he picked up the name because it was popular in the news. Colin thinks those are two different reasons that Douglas is tripping up on and trying to combine into one. It should be one or the other, he believes. On this, I disagree with Colin. Those reasons go together, in my opinion, and they make sense together. The first name that came to Douglas's mind was Vishal because he had seen it in the news. That is a possibility, and it makes sense. The second reason Colin doesn't like the answer he got is because by the time Douglas actually wrote this document in 1983, news coverage on Vishal's case had died down. So it wasn't true that Vishal's name was just constantly in the press all the time. While I agree with Colin here a little, it still isn't proof to me that Douglas is lying. For cases that go insanely popular, the names stick around with the public even after that case has sort of died down in the eyes of the media. Ranga Bila is such a quintessential example of this phenomena, with people like Arundhati Roy using the name in discourse decades later. Is it possible the name Vishal had stuck with Douglas and he remembered it a year after Vishal was found dead? Yes, it is possible. And I think Colin is missing that possibility here. Something else that strikes Colin as weird is how little Douglas claims to know and how nonchalant he seems about where Vishal's body was found, even though Douglas himself says the case was in the news so much, and he himself says how close he lived to where the body was found. If a case is very popular and is on your mind, and the body in that case is found 10 minutes from your own home, wouldn't you know more about it? Wouldn't you talk to people you know about it? Wouldn't you be curious about it? Douglas claims he was none of those things when Vishal's body was found. No, says Douglas, I may not have even noticed the news on that, to be quite frank with you. Weird, Colin thinks. And weird, I think too. But it gets weirder. Remember Kabir, the boy who Douglas was abusing? The boy who now is a man who gave an interview to Colin? The boy who Douglas's thesis paper was actually about? You see, Douglas's obsession with Kabir was so deep, he had tried to adopt Kabir back in the 1980s. And Colin knew about this detail from police records, but Douglas did not know that Colin knew. And so he casually asked Douglas if he had ever tried to adopt any of the boys he had abused, and Douglas's answer was a flat-out no. But then in a different meeting, when Colin told Douglas he had proof of an adoption initiation, Douglas suddenly began to remember. And then with each new meeting with Colin, he seemed to remember more, and eventually did admit he had tried to adopt Kabir. This proved to Colin that Douglas was capable of lying through his teeth and only revealing the truth when he got caught with tangible proof. You want something weirder? It gets weirder. When Colin asked Douglas if he remembers the royal wedding, Douglas says he absolutely does and even remembers the month and year it was in. But when asked what he was doing the day the wedding took place, he has no idea. And I want to pose this question to all of you because I posed it to myself. When you all had major events happening in your city many years ago, do you remember what you were doing on those days? For example, both Aryan and I have mentioned previously on this podcast that we remember exactly where we were the day the Nirbhaya rape took place, even though we were only in the 6th and 7th grade. So is it weird that Douglas doesn't remember what he was doing the day of the royal wedding? It's weird to Colin. In Colin's mind, it makes a lot of sense that Douglas could have been kidnapping, raping and killing Vishal that day, not only because the streets were empty because of the royal wedding, but also because schools were off for the summer at the time, meaning Douglas did not get to pick and abuse boys from Muntham House and had to look elsewhere to satisfy his perverse desires. Over one whole year, Colin takes all of this information and begins to compile it into news reports and media pieces. In one of those pieces, Kabir's brother ends up coming forward with his stories of abuse at Muntham House at the hands of the pedophile Fat John, which, by the way, ended up becoming the first time that the brothers learned that they were both abused.
No.
And that they were both abused by the same man. And they learned this 40 years later about each other. It's just so heartbreaking to me. Like,
You know, you don't often hear the stories of boys that were abused, and I don't think it has to do anything with sexism or anything. It's just I think men feel very ashamed. I'm sure women do as well, but as a man, I'm telling you, like these things, these very deeply emotional things make me feel embarrassed, frankly, and we'd rather not talk about it. But to see that in the case of two brothers, not having found out that they were victims.
Each abused by the same person.
Oh, that's gut-wrenching.
I can't. This case really.
Yeah.
And with each news piece that Colin put out, he hoped Sussex police would pick up on one of those details of the case and begin to dig a little bit.
Well, we've provided them with a summary of the information that we've gained over the last few months. In July, Sussex police told us that they had thoroughly investigated the convicted child offender, the convicted paedophile who had written and titled this document. They had no further plans to look into it.
But despite all of this hard work, Sussex police did what they've been doing for years. Nothing. 2020 turned into 2021, and while COVID shook the world, in the background of it all, the Mehrotra family came closer and closer to the 40th death anniversary of Vishal. And it was right before his 40th death anniversary that Sussex police decided to pay the Mehrotras a visit to get information for an appeal they wanted to do for the 40th anniversary. Eventually, the police cancelled the plans for an appeal and met with the Mehrotras once again, this time to update them on the developments that had come over the last year since Colin had begun doing his work. Colin attends this meeting, and so does retired Inspector Sean Keep. What the Sussex police inspector basically says to the family in this meeting is that there is no proof the pedophiles of Muntham House had anything to do with Vishal's death. They say Douglas's explanation for why he named his thesis Vishal makes sense, and they don't need to investigate further. They say none of the pedophiles from the school had a history of picking up boys from the street because none of them needed to. They had boys right under their care, and so their involvement in Vishal's case doesn't make sense. After saying all of this to the Mehrotras and breaking their heart for the nth time in 40 years, the Sussex police inspector does something unbelievable. She returns some old photographs to Vishu, along with a chunk of Vishal's hair, the last remaining piece of DNA that was gathered from the scene of Vishal's body. And they're returning it, saying they no longer need it. Vishu and Inspector Keep step in, urging the police to take it back with them, to keep it just in case things change, just in case they need it again. And after a lot of back and forth, the inspectors agree to take it back with them. But their move to return the photographs and hair, like Colin described it, felt symbolic. Symbolic of the police giving up on Vishal. But Colin wasn't going to give up. If the police weren't going to help, he was going to continue doing the thing he thought was bringing him closer to justice. Talking to the victims, talking to Douglas, and poking at any and all possible threads he saw in front of him.
It came as a shock. I suppose I should have expected it. It was at the back of my mind. I felt that they might be able to find something.
And there was one glaring thread nobody had managed to poke at yet. That fourth pedophile, Jim Russell, who had a thing for Indian boys to the extent that he had learnt Hindi and had visited India multiple times, even planning a trip with Douglas to just get boys. Jim Russell, who was known to be a risk taker, had gone to prison years before Vishal disappeared for picking up boys from the street and taking them to his home and abusing them. The same Jim who managed to run away to Asia before he ever got caught, who Colin assumes is the man Douglas mentioned decades ago to his favourite kid in the conversation about his friend doing something that could send him to prison, Jim Russell. As Colin begins digging into archival files and more social media profiles and more online databases of land deeds to try and find someone named Jim Russell, he comes up empty-handed. Leads come and leads go, but none turn out to be the Jim Russell they're really looking for. Until one day, Colin gets a call from an anonymous source. The source tells him all he needs to know. A man named Jim Russell, currently living in Sri Lanka with the same age and nationality as pedophile Jim Russell, had been taking his old age fund money from the UK government. That means, by the way, his records are in the UK government database, a database the Sussex police have had access to all of these years. But Colin still needs to be sure this is the Jim he's looking for before he flies to a random old man's house in Sri Lanka and begins asking questions. And so he finds a source in Sri Lanka to go visit the house in question and see what comes up. When the source visits, nobody is home, but neighbours tell the source that an old English man lives there who teaches English to the local children and encourages everyone to send their kids to him for private tuitions. Eventually, the source visits the home a second time to try and meet the Jim living there and sneak a photograph of him under the guise of wanting to learn English. And the source actually succeeds. When Colin receives this picture, he can't quite tell if it's the Jim he's been looking for because the picture of the Jim he has are more than 40 years old. But he takes this photograph to a facial recognition expert at the University of Bradford, who says with 76% likelihood that this is in fact the Jim Russell who could solve Vishal's case. And so completely coincidentally, Colin lands in Sri Lanka on the 29th of July 2022, exactly 41 years after the very day Vishal disappeared from the empty London streets. And just days after he landed, Colin stood in front of Jim's home and knocked on his door. Colin says in the podcast that when he introduced himself to Jim as a BBC journalist trying to investigate the death of Vishal Mehrotra, Jim would kick him straight out of his house, especially because he was still wanted in the UK. But Jim did the exact opposite. He invited Colin into his home and even let him record their conversation. But when questioned about whether or not he abused kids at Muntham House, he only had one thing to say: I absolutely did not. Don't be mistaken, Jim wasn't saying that he was a different Jim and that Colin had found the wrong person. He was the same Jim, Jim Russell, who knew Nicholas Douglas and who also knew the UK police were after him for charges of sexual offences against the kids. He was just saying he had nothing to do with it. Colin pushed, telling him he had spoken to many victims who all remembered him. But Jim repeated, he did not abuse anybody. When asked if he had anything to do with Vishal's death, he said he doesn't even know who that is. When asked where he was on the day of the royal wedding, he had an even weirder answer to give. When did the movie E.T. come out? He asked Colin. The same year, 1981, Colin said. Then I was in India because I remember thinking, well, I'm going to have to go see that, end quote. But then when asked if he had any proof of being in India in 1981, he said he's not sure of his exact dates in India, implying there is no proof for his exact claim. After saying no to all of these questions, he suddenly says yes to one question Colin asks him. Do you have a sexual preference for boys of Indian heritage or boys who are darker skinned? Yes, he says. I believe they're as beautiful as anyone else. In fact, more so, because they're slimmer. Yes, I have got a thing for them. End quote.
Wait, so he accepts having a thing for boys,
But never abusing them.
Could it just be a delusional man
Absolutely.
who thinks
100%.
his acts don't count as abuse?
Yes, and we're getting to that. Yeah.
Oh my god.
Yep. Colin changes the topic at this point, back to Vishal, probing some more and nudging some more, and Jim keeps denying any charge of assault or abuse or murder or even knowing about Vishal. But in the middle of all of the denial, he ends up saying something, one statement that Colin doesn't notice in that moment, but notices days later when he re-listens to the recording of the conversation. I would have given my life to save that kid. I would have given my life to save that kid. To Colin, this is an incredibly odd thing to say about a kid Russell said he doesn't even know about. Does it mean something deeper? Or was Russell just trying to imply that he was the kind of man who would give his life up to save any kid? I guess that's for you to decide. This conversation between Colin and Jim is as troubling and eerie as it is enlightening. After admitting to having a thing for Indian boys, he goes on to talk about how pedophiles are misunderstood, how his urges towards the boys could be best described as protective urges, how whatever he did to those kids didn't really harm them when Colin has had enough, and walks out of Jim's home and informs the Sri Lankan National Child Protection Authority about Russell's presence in Sri Lanka. Shortly after that, the Sri Lankan authorities revoked Russell's Sri Lankan visa for having overstayed in the country and asked him to leave. After being kicked out of the country, Russell went back to the UK the same month, just like Colin anticipated, and ended up being interrogated by Sussex police in the matter of Vishal's death. He said he didn't do it, and the Sussex police left it at that.
Ash, I don't get it. You said that he was a wanted man in the UK
Yep.
regardless. So for whatever
Regardless.
crimes that he was wanted, he would have been caught, right?
They didn't arrest him at that exact moment. They did not. They interrogated him and then.
And just let
nothing
him
happened.
go because he said, I didn't kill.
Yep. But also something's about to happen now that would explain why he didn't get arrested. Something happened. 3 days after his conversation with the police, Jim Russell died of natural causes, possibly ending with himself a shot at justice for Vishal. His last words to the people who saw him get wheeled out of his room into an ambulance: "If I die, I deserve it." With Russell now dead and all other members of this Muntham House pedophile ring in their late 70s, time to find Vishal's killer is closing in. And Colin knew that even back in 2022. And so in a final attempt at closing loops and possibly finding out what really happened to Vishal that afternoon in 1981, Colin decided to search for the other pedophile who was never arrested, whose name only came up intermittently. Fat John, the Muntham House driver who Kabir said he was assaulted by and who Kabir's brother came forward to say he was assaulted by. And the way Colin found Fat John is a remarkable testament to his investigative skills. Colin went back and talked to Kabir and his brother about any memories they had of Fat John, and the two didn't have much. They only knew he was short, fat, Irish, kind of bald, and was the driver for the school responsible for taking the boys to and from their homes. And his modus operandi for abuse was tying up the genitals of the boys and taking photographs of them. None of the other pedophiles, like Nicholas Douglas, seemed to remember this man either. But then Kabir's brother remembered a small, distant memory. On one of the days that Fat John had taken him to his home to abuse him, Kabir's brother remembers reaching his 9th floor apartment using an elevator. To me or you, this may be too small a detail to make anything of. To Colin, it was the key. He began by searching for buildings with 9 or more stories around the area, but found nothing. They were all too short. But he didn't give up. He ended up sending his researcher to the local library, where the researcher dug up photographs of buildings that were torn down between 1981 and 2022, and the researcher found one, a building called Churchill Court. From residential records of the building, Colin found that 6 Johns had lived in the building throughout its history, but in 1981 there was only one, John Harper from apartment 44. Now they knew his name, and so they checked other digitized records and realized something heartbreaking. John Harper had died in 1999 from natural causes too. But that doesn't change the fact that he could still be Vishal's murderer. Colin then tracked down the family members of John, some of whom came forward to confirm that they were sure he was a gay pedophile who had sexually abused kids and had a thing for taking these photographs and tying up the kids' genitals, and had prior convictions too when he worked as a children's entertainer at a local hotel. From these family members, Colin got a photograph of John, which he mixed into photographs of 11 other random men and showed it to Kabir's brother. And within seconds, Kabir's brother picked out John from the group. The brother's response to seeing John's picture was one of the most touching moments of researching this case for me. "Thank you, Colin. Really, thank you. You don't know how important seeing that picture is to me right now. I'm all goosebumps. I could run a mile right now, because I always came to the conclusion that this would be a story no one would believe." End quote. When Colin took all of this information about Jim Russell from Sri Lanka and the digging up of Fat John, when Colin took all of this to the Mehrotras, they seemed to keep coming back to the same issue. If Colin could figure this out, the police could have too. The police could have figured it out sooner, and then maybe there was a real shot at justice. Colin then took all of this information along with Sachin and released the 9-part series titled Vishal in 2023. When the podcast went live, Sussex police visited the Mehrotras once more, this time to apologize for their lapse in judgment, promising to look into all of these people again and promising to start from the top, hopefully giving the family some peace.
My conclusion is very simple. They are potentially trying to brush this under the carpet as far as possible because of this problem having started 38 years ago. And I think they're just a bit too tired of it.
But days after this meeting, when Vishal's sister Mamta met with the new investigators assigned to the case, she realized it was two young, unseasoned officers who seemed more interested in trying to disprove Colin than truly starting the investigation from scratch and make a difference. The Sussex police did the same thing again. They let Vishal's story go, and they broke the family's heart. And this time, by 2023, Vishu was done. Now in his late 70s, he was diagnosed with lung cancer last year, and he no longer wanted to trouble Colin and disturb Colin's family life by consuming it over a case the police did not care about. In his own words, he described how different he is now to the man he once used to be. I was an extrovert and happy-go-lucky and partying kind, lots of friends. And obviously, after you shut yourself off from all of that, you never thought to reconnect with any of those people. If you're saying to me that I've secluded myself into a corner, I think that is true. I did become secluded. The Vishal thing caused me to go into myself. Talking about Vishal, I think there was a great sparkle, but I can't say we sat and joked and laughed. I can't seem to remember that. We must have, because I took them for holidays. I took them to the zoo. I did a lot. But the tragedy has blinkered my eyes completely. I don't seem to have a great memory of all the good things that we did together. I think I might have forced myself to blank them out. Even with Mamta, I have blanked myself out. I do remember the bad things. Whether I did them or my ex-wife did them, I remember the bad things. I can't seem to remember the good things. But I can remember that Vishal was a bright kid. His violin is still up there. I've never got rid of his violin. His report cards from school are still with me. End quote. Even though Vishu sounds done and exhausted, Colin wasn't. With the release of the podcast, he had new tips coming in every day in the form of emails written by people who thought they knew something important. And some of these tips truly were terrifyingly meaningful. For example, one man comes forward to claim that on the day of the wedding, he saw a 40-year-old man wearing khaki pants, which he remembers because they were so unusual for the UK at the time, walking in a field with a little dark-skinned boy walking behind him. The location of the sighting was 20 minutes from the field where Vishal's remains were found. Now, in and of itself, this sighting could mean something or it could not. But combined with the fact that the police documents contain stories from two other completely separate witnesses who had come forward in 1981 to report the exact same sighting, a man in khaki pants with a little dark-skinned Asian boy. And now this is an important tip. There are inconsistencies in the stories of these three separate sightings. One person claims they saw the man with the kid the morning of the wedding, which would be impossible since Vishal was with his father. Another claims it was later in the day after the wedding, which is very possible. But the third claims it was the morning of the next day, which is also possible but contradicts the second person's statement. But if we factor in the natural faults of our memory, what we have in front of us are essentially three people who claim to have seen someone who looks like Vishal with a man the day or after he disappeared. Colin dug deeper into this and tracked down the first man who reported the sighting, but in another tragic turn, learned he had died years ago. Another tip that could have been investigated that is now dead, with the person who held it as a memory for decades. Right after this tip came another very significant one. A retired engineer named Martin Evans came forward to recount how hours after the wedding, on the road that runs across the old corpse where the remains were found, he saw a car parked at a really weird angle, just like Nigel in episode 1 had seen. Martin Evans too, like Nigel, found the positioning of the car so incredibly odd that he pulled out a pen and wrote down the license plate number of the car on a cigarette box. He remembers the car vividly. It was bronzish in color and angular and was two-doored. Martin had actually come forward and told this to the police in 1981 when the police were looking for Vishal, and the police put him through a hypnosis session too, just like Nigel. But after that, Martin Evans never heard from the police again. When Colin heard the description of this car, someone else's car suddenly came to mind. Jim Russell's, the pedophile who had run away to Sri Lanka. Colin reconnected with one of Jim Russell's victims who had been abused in his car in the 1980s and asked this survivor to describe Russell's car. Guess how he described it? Brownie gold.
No
Two-door.
way.
Yeah. This is I cannot with this police. Like,
I mean, Collins, you are, and I love the fact that you don't want to be called an investigative journalist, but
Right.
you've done better investigation than many
then I
journalists
have
out
seen
there.
in so many cases.
But the police should have done this and so much more. How do you not call back a key witness who said they saw a car, wrote down the number on a cigarette box? How do you not call them back for a follow-up? And this is all the Sussex police,
This
right?
is all the Sussex police, yeah. Just bewildering. That's all I keep saying. So that's how Jim Russell described the car, brownie gold and two-door. But with Jim Russell now dead, here is another lead that could have easily been probed further, but is now buried in the depths of the ground. It has since been a year to the release of the BBC podcast on Vishal, and no new significant updates have come to the forefront. The fact of the matter is that people like Colin Campbell can only investigate and dig up information that they give to the cops. The duty to bring justice rests solely with those cops and with our judiciaries. With none of those systems cooperating, there is little for Colin or Vishu or Sachin or Mamta to do. But this case leaves a lot unanswered, a lot to think about. Even as I finish writing my own script and now reading my own script, I have so much going on in my mind. For example, this case makes me wonder why so many pedophiles were roaming the streets of London in the 1970s and 80s. It makes me wonder if this still is the case. It makes me want to look with suspicion at the world around me. There were other theories about what happened to Vishal, and each and every one of them tied back to different pedophile rings running out of the UK in those years. One tied the murder to the notorious child sexual offender and serial killer Sidney Cook, who ran an infamous pedophile ring called the Dirty Dozen, which was confirmed to have raped and killed 3 boys, all aged about the same as Vishal. A different theory tied Vishal's murder to a pedophile ring that ran out of a prominent hotel in the UK called Elm Guest House, where young boys were brought by prominent British high society men who were known to groom and sexually abuse these boys. Many went on to disprove claims of abuse at Elm Guest House, calling it a hoax, but this is all still a lot for me to process. Something else that doesn't quite leave my mind as I tell you this story is the weird sexualization of dark-skinned boys in an otherwise deeply racially divided time in UK history. Being brown or Indian or Pakistani was not easy in 1970s and 1980s London, and that is something everyone in this story has come forward to talk about. Vishu, Mamta, all the survivors from Muntham House who were Indian or Pakistani have all spoken of racial attacks and slurs and discrimination they faced as young people in the UK. In the middle of this atmosphere of racial divide, though, the Muntham House pedophile ring was not one man, but a group of men who all showed sexual preference for brown, specifically Indian and Pakistani boys. That to me is so interesting and so worthy of analysis and begs much larger questions outside the purview of this episode and my expertise. I'm also left thinking about the level of abuse experienced by young boys, which seldom gets talked about or ends up brushed under the rug because men don't cry or men can't get raped. The men of this story hold lifelong, generational trauma, which, believe it or not, is getting transferred onto other young boys because, believe it or not, many of the Muntham House survivors ended up being members of pedophile rings later in life. Colin discovered this tragic truth when he began digging for survivors and was told to stay away from many names on the list because they were all now child sexual abusers themselves. And lastly, I'm left thinking about the police. I hope the workings of Sussex police in this case are an abnormality, not the norm. But that is hard for me to believe. Each and every one of the people in this story, the victims of Muntham House, the witnesses who saw the car on the side of the road, the people who saw the man dressed in khaki, everyone had gone to the police at various points in time over 40 years. Kabir, the abused boy who Douglas wrote his thesis on, had run away from school straight to the nearest police station to tell them he was being abused at this school. But those officers took him right back to Muntham House and dropped him off there, telling him not to run away again. The system didn't just fail Vishal. In fact, the system failing Vishal was a direct consequence of all of the people before him. They had been failing for years. Even at the end of some of our worst cases, I'm left feeling optimistic about the future, but this is not one of those cases. Vishu will soon be gone, and with him will die some of the last living memories of Vishal too. With him, Vishal's murderer will be gone, and with him will die the last chance of the truth too. If you like what we do here at Desi Studios and absolutely love what we're wearing today, this is merch you can go buy all for yourself.
You can buy this Desi Crime merch in our YouTube store on the link down below at Karak Merch. Keep the engines at Desi Studios rolling so we can pay our videographer right behind the camera to make these amazing episodes just for you.